Chapter 15. Halt had hoped to pick up Tennyson's trail again before nightfall, but the short northern day defeated him. As the sun finally sank below the trees and shadows flooded out across the countryside, he reined in and gestured to an open patch of ground beside the track they had been following to the east. "We'll camp here," he said. "No point blundering around in the dark. We'll get an early start and cast around for their tracks." "Can we risk a fire, Halt?" Horace asked. The ranger nodded. "I don't see why not. They're a long way ahead of us now, and even if they do see a fire, there's no reason for them to suspect that someone's following them." After they'd attended to their horses, Horace built a fireplace and scouted round the campsite for wood. In the meantime, Will busied himself skinning and cleaning 2 rabbits that he'd shot during the late afternoon. The bunnies were plump and in good condition, and his mouth watered at the prospect of a savoury stew. He jointed the rabbits, keeping the meaty legs and thighs, and discarding some of the bonier rib sections. Too much trouble to pick over, he'd decided. Then he opened the saddlebag where they kept their supply of fresh food. Often, when they were on the trail, rangers made do with dried meat and fruit and hard bread. When they had the chance to eat more comfortably, they made sure they were ready for it. He briefly considered spitting the rabbits over the open fire and roasting them, but discarded the idea. He felt like something more rewarding. He sliced onions thinly and chopped several potatoes into small pieces. Taking a metal pot from the small array of cooking gear, he placed it in the edge of the fire Horace had started, sitting it on glowing embers. When he judged the iron of the pot was heated, he poured in a little oil, then dropped the onions in a few seconds later. They began to sizzle and brown, and filled the air with a delicious scent. He added a clove of garlic, smashing it to a paste with the end of the stick he was using to stir the pot. More delicious aromas rose. He sprinkled in a handful of spices and seasonings that were his own special mix, and the cooking smells grew richer and richer. Then the joints of rabbit went in, and he moved them around to brown and become coated with the onion and spice mixture. By now, Halt and Horace had moved to sit either side of the fireplace, watching him hungrily as he worked. The rich smell of cooking meat, onions, garlic, and spices filled the air and set their stomachs rumbling. It had been a long, hard day after all. "This is why I like travelling with rangers," Horace said after a few minutes. "When you get the chance, you manage to eat well." "Very few rangers eat this well," Halt told him. "Will has quite a knack with rabbit stew." Will added water to the pot, and, as it began to simmer, he slowly dropped the potato chunks in as well. When the rich-looking liquid began to bubble again, he stirred it and glanced at Halt. The older ranger nodded and reached to his own saddlebag, from which he produced a flask of red wine. Will added a generous glug of it to the stew. He sniffed the fragrant steam rising from the pot and nodded, satisfied with the result. "May need a little of this later to top it up," he said, setting the flask of wine to one side. "Use all you want," Halt said. "That's what it's for." Halt, like most rangers, drank wine only sparingly. 2 hours later, the stew was ready and they ate it with relish. The fragrant, rich meat literally fell off the bones as they ate. Halt had mixed flour and water and salt together into a flat circle and placed it in the hot ashes to one side of the fire. When Will served out the stew, he produced an ash-covered loaf and dusted it off to reveal a golden outer crust. He broke pieces off and passed them to his companions. It was perfect for sopping up the savoury juices of the stew. "This is good bread," Horace mumbled around a mouthful of it. "Haven't had this before." "Hibernian shepherds make it," Halt told him. "It tastes fine when it's hot from the fire like this. When it cools down, it's pretty plain. It's called damper." "Why's that?" Horace asked. Halt shrugged. "Probably because it's damper than proper bread," he said, and that seemed to satisfy Horace. After all, he didn't really care what it was called, so long as he had plenty of it to soak up the delicious juices of the stew. After they had eaten, they gathered together, huddling over Halt's map. "Tennyson and his people were heading this way," Halt said, tracing a path south of southeast. "We're currently heading due east to the point where we left them to go after the Scotty. I think we should try to make up lost ground and assume they'll continue the way they've been going. If we cut the corner and head this way," he indicated a southeasterly direction that would intersect the outsider's trail at an angle, "we should cross their trail tomorrow around the middle of the day." "Unless they change direction," Will said. "That's a risk, of course, but I don't see why they should. They have no idea we're tailing them. There's no reason why they shouldn't head directly for their end destination. But if they have, we'll just have to go back to the point where we first left their trail and track them from there." "If we're wrong, we'll lose the best part of 2 days," Will warned him. Halt nodded. "And if we're right, we'll pick up the best part of a day." Horace listened absently to the discussion. He was happy to go along with whatever his friends decided, and he knew that, these days, Halt was willing to listen to Will's views on the matter. The days were long past when Halt made all the decisions without consultation. Will had earned Halt's respect, and Horace knew he valued the young ranger's opinion. Horace glanced idly at the map, and one place name struck him. He leaned forward and tapped his forefinger on the parchment. "Mackendore," he said. "I thought the countryside looked familiar. That's to the east of us. If we do as you say, we'll be passing pretty close to it." "Be fun to drop in and see how they're doing," Will said. Halt grunted. "We don't have time for social calls." Will grinned easily. "I didn't think we did. I just said it'd be fun, if we did have the time." Halt grunted again and began to roll up the map. Will knew his former teacher's moods by now. He knew that this sudden gruffiness was a sign that the older ranger knew he was taking a calculated risk in heading southeast. He'd never show that he was worried he might be making a mistake, but after years spent together, Will could usually read his thoughts correctly. He smiled quietly to himself. When he was younger, he would never have dreamed that Halt could have doubts. Halt always seemed so infallible. Now he knew that the older ranger had an even greater mental strength, the ability to decide on a course of action and adhere to it, without letting doubt or uncertainty divert him from it. "We'll get them, Halt, don't worry," he said. Halt smiled grimly. "I'm sure I'll sleep better for that reassurance," he replied. They broke camp early. Breakfast was coffee and the remainder of the damper toasted over the fire's coals and smeared with honey. Then, kicking dirt over the fire, they mounted and rode out. The hours passed. The sun went directly overhead, then began to slide down to the west. An hour after noon, they crossed a track heading roughly to the south. As far as Horace was concerned, it seemed no different to 3 or 4 others they had crossed that day, but Will suddenly swung down from the saddle. He went down on one knee and studied the ground in front of him. "Halt!" he called, and the older ranger joined him. There were definite signs that a party of travellers had passed this way. Will touched one footprint, clearer than the rest. It was off to the side of the track in a fortuitously damp section of ground. The footprint had been left by a heavy boot, with its sole bearing a triangular patch along the outer edge. "Seen that before?" Will asked. Halt leaned back, releasing a sigh of relief. "Indeed I have. Up in One Raven Pass. This is Tennyson's party all right." Now that his action was proved to be correct, he was free of the doubt and worry that had plagued him all morning. It had been a risk to take the shortcut. If they had had to return to the point where they first left Tennyson's track, anything could have happened. A storm or heavy rain might have washed out the tracks, leaving them floundering, with no idea which direction Tennyson had taken. "By the look of these tracks, they're less than 2 days ahead of us," he said, with great satisfaction. Will had moved a few meters away, studying the tracks. "They've picked up some horses," he said abruptly. Halt looked at him quickly, then moved to join him. There were clear traces of several sets of hoofprints in the soft earth and grass, a little way off the trail. "So they have," he agreed. "God knows what poor farm they raided to get them. There are only 3 or 4, so most of the party will still be on foot. We could be up to them by tomorrow." "Halt," said Horace. "I've been thinking." Halt and Will exchanged an amused glance. "Always a dangerous pastime," they chorused. For many years, it had been Halt's unfailing response when Will had made the same statement. Horace waited patiently while they had their moment of fun, then continued. Yes, I know. But seriously, as we said last night, Mackendore isn't so far away from here." "And?" Halt asked, seeing how Horace had left the statement hanging. "Well, there's a garrison there, and it might not be a bad idea for one of us to go fetch some reinforcements. It wouldn't hurt to have a dozen knights and men-at-arms to back us up when we run into Tennyson." But Halt was already shaking his head. "2 problems, Horace. It'd take too long for one of us to get there, explain it all, and mobilize a force. And even if we do it quickly, I don't think we'd want a bunch of knights blundering around the countryside, crashing through the bracken, making noise, and getting noticed." He realized that statement had been a little tactless. No offense, Horace. Present company accepted, of course." "Oh, of course," Horace replied stiffly. He couldn't really dispute Halt's statement. Knights did tend to blunder around the countryside making noise and getting noticed. But that didn't mean he had to like it. Halt continued, "The best thing we have going for us is the element of surprise. Tennyson doesn't know we're coming, and that's worth at least a dozen knights and men-at-arms. No, we'll continue as we are for the moment." Horace nodded grudging agreement. When they caught up with the outsiders, they'd have a stiff fight on their hands. Will and Halt would have their hands full dealing with the 2 Genovesan assassins. He would have liked to have even 3 or 4 armed knights behind him to take on the rest of the false prophet's followers. But in the time he'd spent with Halt and Will, he'd learned repeatedly how valuable an ally surprise could be in a fight. Reluctantly, he decided that what Halt said made good sense. The 2 rangers remounted and they set off again, following the trail with renewed purpose. The knowledge that they had narrowed the gap between them and Tennyson to less than a day urged them on. They scanned the horizon for the first sign that they had caught up with their quarry. Will spotted him first. "Halt!" he said. He had the good sense not to point in the direction he was looking. He knew Halt would follow his gaze, and if he were to point, he would alert his quarry to the fact that they had been seen. "On the skyline," he said quietly, "to the right of that forked tree. Don't do that, Horace!" He had seen his friend's hand begin to move, and instinctively he knew Horace was planning to shade his eyes as he gazed at the figure. Horace changed the gesture at the last minute and pretended to scratch the back of his neck. At the same time, Halt dismounted and inspected Abelard's left front hoof. That way, whoever it was wouldn't think they had stopped because he had been spotted. "Can't see anything," Halt told him. "What is it?" "A rider, watching us," Will told him. Halt glanced sideways at the hill without moving his head. He could vaguely make out what might have been the shape of a man and a horse. He was grateful for Will's keen young eyes. Will reached down and unslung his water canteen from the pommel of his saddle. But he managed to do it without losing sight of the figure. He raised the water bottle to his lips, still watching. Then there was a brief flash of movement, and the rider wheeled his horse and disappeared from the skyline. "All right," he said. "You can relax. He's gone." Halt released Abelard's hoof and remounted. His stiff muscles and joints seemed to groan as he did so. "You recognize him?" he asked. Will shook his head. "Too far to make out details. Except what?" Halt asked. When he turned away, I thought I caught a flash of purple. Purple, Horace thought. The colour worn by the Genovesan assassins. So maybe, he said to himself, we might have just lost the element of surprise.